Welcome back to the Somnorian. Get comfortable, dim the lights if they aren't already, pull the blanket up to wherever feels right, and let the day you've had start to slide off your shoulders, because you don't need any of it in here. Tonight we're staying in the strange corners of the medieval world, the ones where people earned a living in ways that would make a modern HR department quietly resign, and we're beginning with a job that sounds like a figure of speech, but was an actual salaried position: the whipping boy. If you enjoy this sort of thing, slow history, no rush, just true stories told in the dark. A like helps the channel more than you'd think, and only subscribe if you genuinely want more of these. And before we go anywhere near a royal nursery, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I love scrolling through the comments and finding someone half a world away drifting off to the same story. Right, let's talk about the boy who got beaten so a prince wouldn't have to. The idea, when you first hear it, sounds like something a satirist made up to mock the aristocracy. A child kept at court specifically to be flogged in place of the young prince, so that the future king could learn his lessons through the pain of his friend rather than his own. But it was real, or at least real enough to leave a paper trail, and to understand why anyone thought this was a sensible arrangement rather than an absurd one, you have to understand a single strange knot at the centre of medieval and early modern kingship: the doctrine that the king's body was sacred. The theory that would later harden into the phrase the divine right of kings held that a monarch was chosen by God, anointed like the kings of the Old Testament, set apart from ordinary men by the sacrament of coronation, and a boy who would one day be that anointed figure carried a little of that untouchability in advance. To strike him, even to correct him, even for his own good, even with the mild birch rod that every other schoolboy in Christendom felt on a regular basis, was to lay hands on a person the Almighty had reserved for a throne. The tutor, however learned, was a commoner, and a commoner raising a hand against the Lord's future anointed was a problem no 15th century schoolmaster wanted on his conscience, or, more practically, on his employment record. So the logic ran downhill in the way medieval logic often did, arriving somewhere deeply weird by entirely coherent steps. If the prince cannot be beaten, and if beating is, in the universal pedagogical wisdom of the age, the only reliable way to install Latin grammar and good behaviour into a boy, then the beating has to land on someone. Enter a second boy, well born enough to be a fitting companion, close enough in age to be a genuine friend, and, crucially, not sacred. He was educated alongside the prince, sat through the same lessons, shared the same tutors and often the same rooms, and when the prince got a sum wrong, or mangled his declensions, or simply misbehaved, the rod came down on the whipping boy instead. The pedagogical theory, and I want to be fair to it because it's not quite as insane as it sounds at first, was that the prince, being fond of his companion, would be so pained by watching his friend suffer for his own mistakes that he'd apply himself out of guilt and affection rather than fear of his own skin. Whether that theory ever actually worked is a question we'll come back to, because the evidence is a little embarrassing. The most famous name attached to the role is Barnaby Fitzpatrick, companion to the young Edward VI of England, the sickly boy king, son of Henry VIII, who came to the throne in 1547 at the age of 9. Fitzpatrick was an Irish nobleman's son, a few years older than Edward, brought into the royal household as a companion, and popular tradition has cast him ever since as the archetypal whipping boy, the flesh and blood original of the trope. I have to be honest with you here because the Somnorian doesn't do the thing where a fun story gets stated as hard a fact than it deserves. The documentary evidence that Fitzpatrick was literally beaten for Edward's failings is thin, and some historians think the whipping boy label got attached to him later, retrofitted onto a real and close friendship. What we do know is genuinely charming on its own. When Edward became king and Fitzpatrick was sent off to France, the two exchanged letters, and Edward, a monarch, an anointed king, a boy who could in theory have anyone in the realm flogged, wrote to his friend with the fussy, affectionate concern of someone who'd grown up beside him, warning him against the temptations of the French court, its gambling and its wanton pleasures, and telling him to stick to serious pursuits. Which is to say, the king spent his correspondence nagging his old schoolmate to behave. If Fitzpatrick really did take Edward's beatings, then the emotional bookkeeping came out about as tenderly as this arrangement ever could. One boy got the throne, the other got the scars, and the throne spent its letters worrying about the scars. The far better documented case, the one that lets us say, yes, this job unambiguously existed and here is the man's name and his pay, comes a little later and belongs to a Scotsman, So bear with me across the edge of our strictly medieval window, because the institution itself has genuine medieval roots, and this is simply where the paperwork survives best. His name was William Murray, and he was the appointed whipping boy to the future Charles I of England in the very early 1600s, when Charles was a small and sickly Scottish prince. Murray did well out of it, which is the detail that reorganises the whole story in your head. He grew up alongside the prince. The prince grew fond of him exactly as the theory predicted, and when Charles became king he did not forget the boy who'd absorbed his childhood punishments. Murray was made a gentleman of the bedchamber, then raised to the peerage as the Earl of Dysart, and he ended his life the master of Ham House on the Thames, a lavish riverside mansion that still stands and that you can walk through today. Its rooms and gardens preserved more or less as a 17th century grandee would have known them. So the career arc of a professional whipping boy, when it worked, ran from taking a rod across the back for another child's arithmetic to dying an earl in a house so fine it's now a heritage site. The beatings, it turns out, were an internship, and that reframing is the thing I find genuinely lovely about this job, once you get past the wince. The whipping boy looks, from a distance, like the most abject position imaginable. A child hired to be hurt, the human embodiment of taking the fall. But the actual mechanism of the role was proximity to power in its most concentrated form. You were raised beside the person who would one day command an entire kingdom. You shared his tutors, his meals, his loneliness, his boredom. You were, by design, his closest attachment in a childhood otherwise populated by deferential adults who could never quite be friends with a future king. The whole Grimm theory depended on the prince loving you. That was the load-bearing beam of the entire arrangement, and a prince who loved you as a boy tended to be a king who rewarded you as a man. The pain was real, and the affection was the point, and in the strange economy of the medieval and early modern court, being the person the future monarch could not bear to see suffer turned out to be one of the safest long-term investments a well-born family could make with a spare son. It was, functionally, the medieval version of befriending the boss's kid in the mailroom, except the mailroom involved a birch rod, and the boss's kid grew up to rule by the grace of God. Now the whipping boy is the headline act, the one everybody's half heard of, but he was far from the only person at court drawing a wage for a job that reads today like a dare. The medieval and early modern royal household was an enormous, ravenous institution, hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 people orbiting a single anointed body, and every physical need, every ritual, every inch of the king's day had a specific person assigned to it, holding an office, often earning a salary and frequently guarding that office with the ferocity of a man protecting a family inheritance, because that is exactly what these posts became. Consider the royal household of the English kings, whose structure we can reconstruct in real detail from surviving ordinances like the Black Book of Edward IV, drawn up in the 1470s, which lists the offices, the ranks, the daily allowances of bread and ale and candles, the whole clockwork of who did what and who was fed how much. It is one of the great documents of medieval domestic bureaucracy, and it reveals a world in which the king was never, for a single waking moment, meant to do anything for himself. There were men whose entire function was to carry a particular dish, men who guarded a particular door, a whole subdivision of the household devoted to the king's meat, another to his wine, another to his fires, each with its own hierarchy and its own jealously defended right to be the one who did the small specific thing. Take the office of the king's champion, held for centuries by the Dimoke family of Lincolnshire, a genuinely hereditary job, passed down the bloodline like a surname, whose duty came due exactly once per reign. At the coronation banquet, the king's champion would ride into Westminster Hall on horseback, in full armour, and a herald would proclaim a formal challenge. If any man denied the new sovereign's right to the throne, the champion would fight him then and there in single combat to prove it. He then threw down his gauntlet on the flagstones and waited. Nobody, across the entire run of English coronations, ever picked it up. The challenge was ritual, theatre, a piece of living pageantry rather than a serious offer of a duel, and so the champion's real job was to sit on a horse indoors, in a great hall packed with feasting nobles, issue a threat that everyone knew was rhetorical, collect the gold cup he drank from as his fee, and go home for another 20 or 30 years until the next king needed challenging on behalf of. The Demokes held this right for generations, defended it in court when rivals tried to claim it, and treated the privilege of galloping into a banquet to menace an empty room as the treasured family asset it genuinely was. It is the single most medieval sentence I can offer you. There was a family whose ancestral profession was threatening to fight anyone who objected to the king, in a room where no one ever objected. And the doors, I keep coming back to the doors, because the geography of a royal household was a geography of access, and access was the whole currency of court life. The closer a room stood to the king's body, the more valuable the right to enter it, and so the household radiated outward in concentric rings of exclusivity. The great hall where hundreds ate, then the chamber, then the privy chamber, then the bedchamber, then the innermost spaces where only a tiny handful of trusted servants were permitted, and every one of those thresholds was a checkpoint policed by someone whose whole identity was tied to controlling it. Ushers, grooms, gentlemen of this and that. The titles multiply, and each one marked a precise coordinate in the great map of who could get how near the sacred person. To be a groom of the chamber was to have physical access. Most of the realm's dukes could only envy, and men schemed, bribed, and married their way toward these posts precisely because nearness to the king was nearness to every decision, every grant of land, every appointment and pardon and favour that flowed from the crown. The whipping boy, in the end, was just the childhood version of the same principle carried to its most literal extreme, a system in which the way to secure your family's fortune was to place your son as physically close to the future king's body as humanly possible, even if as close as possible meant taking the punishments meant for the royal one. Which brings us to the strangest feature of this whole world, the thing I want to leave you turning over as we settle deeper into the dark. None of these people thought their jobs were absurd. The whipping boy, the champion galloping into the banquet, the grooms guarding the sequence of doors, the men appointed to the king's fires and the king's meat and the king's wine. Every one of them was operating inside a system that made perfect internal sense, a system built on the wholly sincere belief that a king was a different order of being, half man and half sacrament, and that arranging an entire human institution around the care and protection and untouchability of his single body was not eccentric but obvious, even holy. We look back and see the comedy, the beaten child, the empty challenge, the earl who got his title for his childhood bruises, because we've lost the belief that made it all cohere. They didn't see comedy at all. They saw a boy being prepared, with the appropriate seriousness to sit one day at the exact centre of the world, and they saw the people arranged around him not as a caste of ludicrous functionaries, but as the necessary machinery of the divine, and one of those necessary parts, drawing his wage and taking his beatings and waiting patiently to be made an earl, was a boy whose entire profession was to hurt so that the future king would learn to be gentle. Chapter 2. Groom of the Stool, climbing the ladder by the toilet. So let's talk about the single most desirable job in the household of an English king, a position men of the highest birth actively schemed to obtain, one that made its holders rich, trusted and politically untouchable. And let's sit for a moment with the fact that this coveted, career-defining, aristocracy-envied post consisted at its literal core of helping the king relieve his bowels, the groom of the stool. And I want to promise you up front that I'm not going to spend this whole chapter smirking, because the genuinely interesting thing here isn't the toilet. It's how a job that began at the toilet climbed, over roughly 2 centuries, into one of the most powerful offices in the English state, and what that climb tells you about how power actually worked in a world organised entirely around a single sacred body. The stool in the title was the close stool, the medieval and Tudor toilet, which was not a fixed plumbed fixture but a portable piece of furniture. A padded box often upholstered in velvet and studded with gilt nails, with a hinged lid and a pewter or ceramic basin set inside it. The grander the household, the grander the close stool, and a king's was a genuine object of craftsmanship. We have inventory descriptions of Henry VIII's close stools covered in black velvet, trimmed with ribbon and fringe, fitted with basins, the whole apparatus as richly appointed as any chair of state, which in a sense it was. The groom of the stool was the man responsible for this device, and for the royal act performed upon it. He carried or oversaw it, he ensured it was clean and supplied, he attended the king during use, and yes, the sources are fairly frank about this. He assisted in the aftermath, providing water, cloths, and whatever else the moment required. Stated that baldly, in a modern room, it sounds like a punishment or a punchline. In the Tudor court it was a plum, and grasping why is the whole point. Start with the same principle that governed the whipping boy: access. The king's body was the centre of gravity of the entire kingdom, and the close stool was one of the very few moments in a monarch's endlessly attended, endlessly public life when he was genuinely alone with a single servant, behind a closed door, physically vulnerable, and, this is the crucial part, talking. A king on the close stool was a king with time on his hands and no council, no ambassadors, no crowd, just one trusted man in the room, and a monarch who trusted you enough to attend him at his most private and undignified moment was a monarch who trusted you, full stop, with his thoughts, his complaints, his offhand opinions about which courtier had annoyed him that morning and which petition he was minded to grant. The groom of the stool was, by the raw mechanics of the job, the man with the most reliable private audience with the king in the entire realm, and in a court where a whispered word at the right moment could redirect a career or a war, that private audience was worth more than almost any amount of land. The dukes and earls who could barely get into the outer chamber understood exactly what the groom had, and they hated him for it, and courted him for it in equal measure. And so the office rose. Under the earlier medieval kings it had been a genuinely menial body service role, one intimate task among the many that the grooms of the chamber performed for a monarch who did nothing for himself. But across the 15th and especially the 16th century, as the most private rooms of the palace, the privy chamber and the bedchamber became the true engine room of politics. The men who staffed those rooms rose with them, and the groom of the stool, being the most intimate body servant of all, rose highest. By the reign of Henry VIII, the post had transformed almost beyond recognition. The groom was now, in practice, the chief officer of the king's privy chamber, the head of the king's most personal staff, the keeper of the privy purse, meaning he controlled a great deal of the king's private money, disbursing funds, keeping the accounts, handling the royal finances at their most personal and discretionary level. He held the keys to the private apartments. He controlled who got in to see the king in his most private spaces, which made him a gatekeeper in the most literal and lucrative sense, since anyone wanting a quiet word with the sovereign had to get past him first. The man who had begun the story attending a velvet box had become the man who controlled access to the king's private purse, and the king's private ear, a trifecta of intimacy, money and access that made the groom of the stool one of the most quietly powerful men in England. The names bear this out because these were not lowly servants. They were gentlemen and knights from good families who counted the office as the making of them. Under Henry VIII, the post was held by men like Sir William Compton, who used his closeness to the young king to accumulate a genuinely enormous fortune in lands and offices, dying one of the richer men in the country off the back of a career that ran through the royal bedchamber. Later came Sir Henry Norris, who as groom of the stool was among the most intimate and trusted figures around Henry, and whose intimacy became, in the end, the thing that destroyed him, because when the king turned against Anne Boleyn in 1536, Norris was one of the men accused of adultery with the Queen and executed for it, his closeness to the royal person curdling from an asset into a death sentence. That is the shadow side of the whole arrangement, and it is worth sitting with. The same proximity that made these men rich also placed them permanently inside the blast radius of the king's moods, his suspicions, and his marital catastrophes. To be near the sacred body was to be near the fire, and Norris learned on the scaffold that the fire did not distinguish between the men who warmed themselves at it and the men it decided to consume. There is a wonderful, telling detail from the reign of Henry's son, the boy king Edward VI, that shows just how sensitive the office had become. When Edward came to the throne as a child, the men around him understood that whoever controlled the private apartments controlled the king, and the post of chief gentleman of the privy chamber and the intimate body service roles became pieces on the board in the vicious factional struggles of the minority government. Because to have your man attending the boy king in private was to have your hand, at all times, on the most powerful lever in the country. The plumbing had become politics. A job defined by a basin had become a job that could tilt the governance of a kingdom, and the great men of the realm fought over it precisely because they understood that in a court built around a body, the servant closest to the body's most private functions was closest to its mind. I find it genuinely clarifying, this office, because it strips the whole medieval and Tudor theory of power down to its plainest mechanism. We tend to imagine that authority in these centuries flowed through grand visible channels: titles, armies, parliaments, great offices of state with seals and ceremonies, and it did, partly. But underneath all of that ran a second, quieter circuit, the circuit of physical intimacy with the royal person, and that circuit often carried more current than the visible one. The Lord Chancellor had the Great Seal. The groom of the stool had the king every morning alone at ease and talking, and when you ask which of those two was more likely to actually shape a royal decision, the answer is not always the one with the seal. The Tudors understood this with total clarity, which is why the intimate offices of the Privy Chamber were staffed with trusted gentlemen and guarded like treasure, and why an ambitious family's dream was not merely a title, but a son placed inside the private apartments, close to the body, close to the ear, close to the purse. And here is the part that I think is easy to miss if you only stop at the giggle. The men who held this office were not embarrassed by it. Quite the reverse. They were proud of it, listed it among their honours, had it recorded on their monuments and in their titles, because everyone who mattered understood exactly what it signified. To be groom of the stool was to advertise, in a single phrase, that the King of England trusted you above nearly everyone else alive. Trusted you in the room, with the purse, with the door, with the private thoughts spoken in the one place no one else could hear them. The task at the centre of it was, yes, undignified by any ordinary reckoning, but dignity at court was not measured by the ordinariness or grandness of a task. It was measured by nearness to the sacred person, and by that measure the man kneeling beside the velvet box outranked half the peerage. The job description that reads today like the worst assignment in the palace was understood by the people who actually lived inside that world as one of the very best. A lifetime appointment to the exact centre of everything, reached as it happened by way of the toilet. So the next time the phrase climbing the career ladder crosses your mind, spare a thought for the specific ladder these men climbed. One whose bottom rung was a padded box in a private room, and whose top rung was control of the king's money, the king's door and the king's ear. A ladder ascended not in spite of the intimacy of the work, but precisely because of it, in a world where the shortest path to power ran directly through the most private moments of an anointed body. And the man holding the cloth was, more often than the man holding the seal, the man who mattered. Chapter 3. The Gong Farmer's Golden Filth. Now we go down from the velvet privy chamber where the last chapter left us, down through the floors of the medieval city, down past the cesspits and the drains and into the single foulest, best paid, most quietly essential trade in the whole urban economy. The gong farmer, the man who emptied the toilets, worked only in darkness and earned a wage that would have made a skilled carpenter blink. And I promise you, the pay is not a joke or an exaggeration. It's the detail that turns this from a story about filth into a story about how a society prices the work it cannot bear to look at. Start with the word, because it's better than any I could invent. Gong comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go, a euphemism for the privy so old and so worn down that by the medieval period, the gong simply meant the toilet, the place you went. The pit beneath it was the gong, or the gong pit, and the man who emptied that pit was the gong farmer, sometimes called a gong firmer or a nightman, and his job was exactly what it sounds like, to descend into the accumulated waste of a household, a tenement, or an entire building, dig it out, load it, and carry it away. In an age before sewers, before plumbing, before any of the infrastructure we never think about until it fails, every deposit made in every privy in every city had to go somewhere, and the somewhere was a cesspit, a lined or unlined hole beneath or beside the building, and cesspits filled up. When they filled, someone had to empty them by hand, in the dark, one bucketful at a time, and that someone was the gong farmer. The medieval city was, to a modern nose, an assault. London, Paris, Cologne, any dense town of the period was threaded through with the smell of human and animal waste, because the volume of it was staggering, and the means of removing it were entirely muscular. Households used chamber pots and emptied them, ideally into the cesspit, less ideally into the street or the nearest watercourse, which is why medieval city ordinances are full of exasperated rules about not throwing your waste out the window onto passers-by. Rules that existed precisely because people kept doing it. Public latrines were built over rivers and streams to carry the waste away by current. London had a famous large public privy on London Bridge that discharged straight into the Thames, and another notorious facility called the Longhouse, on the bank of the river, a communal toilet of many seats serving the crowds of the medieval city. But most waste ended up in cesspits, and cesspits were the gong farmer's domain, and the work of emptying them was as grim as any labour the medieval economy produced. Here is why it paid. First, the sheer unpleasantness, obvious but real, and a society will pay to have done the thing that nobody will do for a normal wage. Second, and less obvious, it was genuinely dangerous, and not merely in a slip-and-fall way. The decomposing contents of a cesspit generate gases: methane, hydrogen sulfide, the invisible products of years of rot, and a man lowered into a deep pit to dig it out was lowering himself into an atmosphere that could suffocate him without warning. There are records of gong farmers overcome by the fumes, collapsing into the very filth they were extracting, and the most infamous case is a man remembered as Richard the Raker, a raker being a related trade, the men who raked and cleared the muck and refuse from the streets. Richard the Raker, according to the grimly memorable record, fell through the rotten planks of his own privy in the 14th century and drowned, as the chronicle phrases it, in his own excrement. It is the single most on-the-nose death in the medieval archive, and I tell it not to be crude, but because it captures, in one horrible image, exactly what these men risked. The material they worked in could poison them, could bury them, could drown them, and occasionally did. Third, and this is the constraint that really drove the wage up, they were legally forbidden to work during the day. By ordinance in London and in many other towns, gong farmers could only ply their trade at night, after a certain hour, when the streets were empty and the citizens asleep, because no one wanted to see or smell the work being done, and no one wanted a cart of human waste trundling past their shop front at noon. This is why the alternative name was Nightman, and it's why the job carried a strange, nocturnal, half-hidden quality. The gong farmer belonged to the hours when the respectable city was in bed. He worked by lantern light, hauled his loads through dark streets, and carried the waste out to designated dumping grounds beyond the walls, to the lay stalls, the official refuse dumps, or to fields where, in one of the tidy circularities of the pre-modern economy, a great deal of it became fertiliser, sold on to farmers to enrich their crops, which is the sense in which the gong farmer was, without irony, farming. He harvested the city's waste and sold it back to the land. The restriction to night hours meant the work was slow, that a big job could take many nights, and that the labour pool willing to do it was small, and a small labour pool doing essential, dangerous, nocturnal, universally shunned work is a labour pool that can name its price, and name it they did. The surviving figures are genuinely startling. Emptying a single cesspit could cost a household a substantial sum, and gong farmers could earn in a night what a common labourer earned in a week or more. In later, better documented periods the numbers become explicit, men doing this work commanding wages that placed them, in pure earning terms, well above the ordinary run of manual tradesmen, the kind of money that let a gong farmer over a career accumulate real property and a comfortable estate. The economics were brutally simple and slightly beautiful. The more a job repels people, the fewer people will do it, and the fewer people will do it, the more you must pay the ones who will. The gong farmer sat at the extreme end of that curve, a job so universally avoided that the wage had to climb high enough to overcome the deepest, instinctive, human aversion there is. And so the man covered head to foot in the worst substance the city produced went home with a purse that a clean-handed clerk would have envied. The city paid, through gritted teeth and pinched nose, exactly what the work was worth to be rid of, and the work was worth a great deal. There's a further wrinkle I love, which is that this was often a regulated, semi-official trade rather than a free-for-all. Cities did not simply leave the removal of their waste to chance. The work was too essential and too fraught for that. In London, the gong farmers were, in effect, recognised by the civic authorities, subject to rules about where and when, and how they could dump their loads, and in some periods organised enough to be treated as a proper occupational group. There were official dumping sites, penalties for dumping in the wrong place, ordinances about the hours, a whole apparatus of regulation around the movement of human waste, which is exactly what you'd expect from a medieval urban government that understood, even without any theory of germs, that letting filth accumulate in the streets bred disease, stench, and disorder. The gong farmer operated inside this framework, shunned socially, essential practically, regulated officially, and paid extremely well for the privilege of being the man the city needed but could not stand to acknowledge. And that contradiction is the whole heart of the trade, the thing worth carrying with you into the dark. The gong farmer was, by any social measure, at the very bottom. His work was the definition of filthy. His hours were the hours of thieves and ghosts. His very presence was something the respectable city arranged never to witness. And yet he was, by the measure that a modern economist would use, doing extraordinarily well. Highly paid, in steady and unfailing demand, running a trade that could not be outsourced, automated, or wished away, because as long as people ate they would need him, and they always ate. He was despised and indispensable in exactly equal measure, and the wage was the society's way of resolving that tension, of admitting, in the only language it couldn't lie in, the language of money, that it needed him far more than it wished to. The nobles in the last chapter got rich by being as close as possible to the king's body. The gong farmer got rich by being as close as possible to the one thing the king's body and everybody else's produced and could not deal with. And in a strange way, both fortunes came from the same source, the endless human need to have someone else handle the parts of life we would rather not touch. So spare him a thought tonight. The nightman with his lantern and his cart, moving through the sleeping medieval city while the respectable citizens dreamed above their own cesspits, doing the work none of them would do, breathing air that could kill him, and heading home before dawn with a heavy purse and a smell that no amount of washing would fully lift. He is one of the great unsung figures of the medieval economy, the man at the absolute bottom of the social ladder who was, quietly and against every expectation, doing better than most of the people who wouldn't meet his eye. Proof, in the end, that the medieval world, for all its obsession with rank and blood and holy anointed bodies, had one perfectly clear-eyed mechanism for valuing labour, and it valued the man who dealt with its filth exactly as highly as the filth was hard to deal with. Chapter 4. Professional mourners and the grief economy. Now to a trade that ran on the one commodity you might think couldn't possibly be bought: sorrow. Because in the medieval world, when someone died and the family wanted the funeral to feel as heavy, as full, as loudly grief-stricken as the dead person's status demanded, they did the sensible thing. They hired the grief in. Professional mourners. People paid in coin to weep, wail, tear their hair, and follow the coffin sobbing for a stranger they had never met. And the more you paid, the harder they cried. Tonight we're in the strange, oddly moving economy of performed sorrow, and I'll warn you now that this one is funnier and sadder than it first appears, often in the same breath. The practice is ancient, far older than the medieval period. The hired mourner reaches back into the deep antiquity of the Mediterranean and the Near East, and the medieval world inherited a tradition that was already thousands of years old by the time a 14th century widow was arranging her husband's funeral. In the ancient world, these figures were sometimes called by the Latin praeficae, professional wailing women engaged to lead the lamentation, and the custom of hiring them threads through the funerary practices of countless cultures, precisely because it answers a real and universal need: the belief that the dead deserve to be mourned loudly, visibly, and abundantly, and that the volume of grief at a funeral is a measure of the honour being paid to the person in the coffin. A quiet funeral was a poor funeral, a shameful one, a signal that the dead person had mattered to no one, and so a family that could afford to would ensure their dead were sent off amid a proper, audible storm of sorrow, and if the household's own supply of tears ran short, the market was there to top it up. To understand why this made sense rather than seeming grotesque, you have to understand that the medieval funeral was not a private ceremony of the modern kind, an intimate gathering of the genuinely bereaved. It was a public event, a piece of social theatre, a display of the dead person's status and the family's standing, and like all such displays it had expected forms that had to be met. A great man's funeral was a procession through the streets, a spectacle witnessed by the whole community, and the community read that spectacle for meaning. How many mourners, how richly dressed, how many candles, how much noise. The lamentation was part of the performance, and performance is exactly the right word, because medieval mourning was expressive in a way the modern, restrained Northern European funeral is not. Grief was meant to be shown, loudly and physically. Weeping, wailing, the beating of the breast, the tearing of hair and clothes, cries and lamentations that filled the streets as the procession passed. This was the vocabulary of proper mourning, and a family that wanted to speak that vocabulary fluently, at volume, at length, with the full expected intensity, could engage professionals who knew every word of it. And these professionals were skilled, which is the detail that lifts the whole thing out of mere absurdity. Wailing convincingly at length, on cue, for hours, is not something anyone can simply do. It is a performance requiring stamina, technique, and a real theatrical ability to summon and sustain the appearance of overwhelming emotion for a person you have no feelings about whatsoever. The professional mourner had to arrive, take up her place in the procession or at the graveside, and produce grief, the right kind, at the right pitch, sustained through a long ceremony without flagging, without breaking character, without letting the performance slip into the mechanical. The good ones were genuinely accomplished at it, able to lead a crowd's emotion, to set the tone of a lamentation, and carry the assembled mourners along with them, so that the hired grief seeded and amplified whatever real grief was present until the whole gathering was swept up in a collective outpouring. In this, the professional mourner was less a fraud than a kind of emotional conductor, the person who started the crying and kept it going, whose job was to give the community permission and a lead to follow in expressing a sorrow that might otherwise have stayed locked up and silent. The church had a complicated relationship with all of this, and the tension is one of the more interesting threads in the story. On one hand, extravagant, wailing, hair-tearing lamentation had distinctly pre-Christian roots. It belonged to the old world, the pagan world, the world of excessive public grief that Christian doctrine wanted to temper with the consolation of the resurrection and the promise that the dead were not lost but merely gone ahead. Churchmen at various points frowned on the more theatrical and frenzied displays, on the hired wailing and the ostentatious lamentation, seeing in them a want of Christian hope, a heathen excess unbecoming of people who were supposed to believe in eternal life. Reforming voices periodically inveighed against the practice, tried to restrain it, preferred the sober dignity of psalms and prayers to the loud grief of hired women beating their breasts. On the other hand, the impulse behind it was hard to kill, because it answered something the sober version did not, and the practice persisted across the medieval centuries and well beyond, in various forms across Europe, precisely because the human need it served, to have the dead loudly and visibly honoured, was stronger than the theological objection to how it was done. The economics, meanwhile, were straightforward and a little bleak. The professional mourner was, at bottom, doing piecework in the gig economy of death, showing up for the job, delivering the performance, collecting the fee, and moving on to the next funeral, and the fee scaled with the effort and the status of the occasion. A grander funeral wanted more mourners and louder ones. A family with money could hire a substantial contingent of professional weepers to swell the procession and thicken the lamentation, so that the sheer number of grieving figures broadcast the importance of the dead. There was in effect a market with tiers. More coin bought, more grief, more mourners, more noise, a bigger and more impressive display of sorrow, and the whole thing operated on the same logic as any luxury display, where the point was partly the thing itself and partly the conspicuous demonstration that you could afford it. To hire a great crowd of professional mourners was to announce that your family had both the wealth to pay them and the standing to warrant such an outpouring, and the funeral became, among its other meanings, an advertisement of status conducted in the currency of tears. Now the modern reflex is to find something distasteful in this. Grief for sale, sorrow as a commodity, the crocodile tears of strangers who felt nothing standing in for the real feeling of people who did. And I understand the reflex, but I gently push back on it, because I think it misreads what the medieval funeral was actually for. It was not primarily an occasion for the private, interior grief of the immediate family. It was a communal rite, a public honouring of the dead and a public marking of the tear in the social fabric that a death represented, and in that context the hired mourner was performing a genuine social function, not perpetrating a fraud. The tears were understood by everyone present to be in part a performance. Nobody imagined the wailing women had loved the deceased, and the performance was the point, a formal, expected, honourable contribution to the ceremony, no more dishonest than a musician hired to play at a wedding is dishonest for not being personally overjoyed at the marriage. The professional mourner supplied a service the community valued. She ensured the dead were sent off with the full weight of lamentation their status required. She gave the ceremony its proper emotional shape, and she led the assembled grief toward its proper expression. That is not deception. That is craft in the service of ritual. And there is something, I think, genuinely tender buried in the whole arrangement, which is worth sitting with as we drift toward the end of this one. Behind the hired grief lay a conviction that the medieval world held with total seriousness, that no one should go into the ground unmourned, that to die without lamentation was a kind of second death, a final poverty worse than the material kind, and that the loud honouring of the dead mattered enough to arrange, to pay for, to guarantee. The professional mourner existed because the community could not bear the thought of a silent funeral, an unwept passing, a death that slipped away without anyone marking its weight. And so even the person who died without family to grieve them, if there was coin enough, could be sent off amid the full sound of sorrow, honoured at the end by voices raised in lamentation, even if those voices had been engaged that very morning and would move on to another graveside by nightfall. There is real fraud in the world, and real cynicism, but I have trouble finding much of either in a custom whose deepest logic was simply that everyone in the end deserves to be cried for, and that if the tears could not be found, they could at least mercifully be bought. So the professional mourner takes her place in our gallery of strange medieval trades. The woman who wept for a living, who followed the coffins of strangers through the streets producing on command the sorrow that the occasion demanded, and who went home each evening with a purse full of coin earned by the reliable, skilled, oddly generous work of making sure the dead of a whole community were sent into the ground, amid the proper storm of grief, whether the world had loved them or not. Chapter 5. Leech Collectors and the Wading Wage. Now to a job whose entire business model was, in the most literal possible sense, being slowly drained of your own blood. The leech collector, the person who waded into the cold, muddy shallows of ponds and marshes, and used their own bare legs as bait, standing there while the leeches fastened on, letting themselves be bitten dozens of times a day so the medical profession would have a fresh supply of the little creatures it could not. For most of 1,000 years, imagine practicing medicine without. Tonight we're wading into the medieval blood trade, and I mean wading precisely, because for the people at the bottom of the supply chain, the work was exactly that, standing in a pond, being eaten. To understand why anyone would do this, you have to understand how completely the leech had captured the medieval medical imagination, and to understand that, you have to understand the theory of the four humours, which was the load-bearing framework of Western medicine from antiquity straight through the medieval period and astonishingly well beyond. The theory, inherited from the Greeks, from Hippocrates and elaborated by Galen, whose authority hung over medieval medicine like a second scripture, held that the human body was governed by four fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance among the four. Illness was imbalance, an excess of one humour throwing the whole system out of true, and the logical treatment for an excess was removal. If a patient had too much blood, or a fever that suggested too much blood, or really any of a vast range of ailments that the physicians attributed to a plethora of blood, then the obvious remedy was to take some of that blood out. This was bloodletting, phlebotomy, one of the central therapeutic acts of medieval medicine, prescribed for an enormous range of conditions, performed on the healthy as a preventive measure and on the sick as a cure, so routine and so foundational that questioning it would have been like questioning the value of rest. Bloodletting could be done by opening a vein with a blade, the work of the barber surgeon, whose red and white striped pole still advertises this bloody heritage on high streets today. The red for blood and the white for the bandages. But the blade was crude, hard to control, unsuitable for delicate areas, and frankly alarming to patients, and so for a great many applications the preferred instrument was not steel but the leech, Hirudo medicinalis, the European medicinal leech, a segmented aquatic worm with a three-jawed sucker that latches onto the skin, bites a neat three-radial wound, and draws blood steadily, while secreting a compound that keeps the blood flowing freely. The leech had real advantages. It drew blood gently and gradually rather than in an alarming gush. It could be applied to precise spots and to delicate places where a blade could not safely go, around the eyes, in the mouth, wherever the physician judged the excess blood needed drawing, and it did the work itself, requiring only to be placed and then removed once it had fed. For centuries it was among the most used tools in the entire medical kit, and the demand for it was correspondingly vast. Every physician, every barber surgeon, every apothecary wanted a supply of live, hungry leeches ready to hand, and that supply had to come from somewhere. It came from the wetlands, and it came out of them on human legs. The medicinal leech lived in ponds, marshes, slow streams and boggy shallows, and the way you harvested it was to give it something to bite. The classic method, and it is as grim as it sounds, was for the collector to wade into the leech-bearing water bare-legged and simply stand there, or walk slowly through the shallows, offering their own skin as living bait. The leeches, sensing the disturbance and the warmth, would swim over and fasten on, and the collector would let them attach, wait, and then pull the engorged creatures off their own legs and drop them into a container to carry to market. It was, as a working method, a straightforward transfer of blood from the collector to the merchandise. The leech got fat on the harvester's blood, and the harvester got a leech worth selling, having paid for it in the only currency the leech accepted. A collector working a good pond could pull dozens of leeches from their legs in a day, which means dozens of bites, dozens of small wounds, each leaking freely thanks to the leech's anticoagulant, and a day's work that left the harvester genuinely, measurably drained. And the toll was real. Leech bites do not clot quickly. That is the whole medical point of the leech, that its saliva keeps the blood flowing. So a collector emerged from the water bleeding from every point of attachment, the small wounds continuing to weep long after the leeches were removed. Do this day after day, season after season, and you're subjecting your body to a chronic cumulative blood loss that could leave collectors pale, weak, and anemic, worn down by the very trade that fed them, their own vitality slowly siphoned off into the buckets of merchandise they carried to the apothecaries. There were secondary miseries too, the cold of standing for hours in pond water, the risk of infection from the many small wounds, the general wretchedness of the working conditions in marshy, insect-thick, boggy ground. It was low status, physically depleting, genuinely unpleasant work, done largely by the rural poor, by people with few better options, who traded their blood by the pint for a subsistence living at the very bottom of a medical supply chain whose upper end was populated by learned physicians in fine robes charging handsome fees. The demand, meanwhile, only grew, and by the later centuries it grew to a frankly staggering scale that reshaped whole landscapes. This is jumping past our strict medieval window, but it's the natural endpoint of the trade, and it's too striking to leave out. The mania for leeching reached its peak in the early 19th century, when medicine's faith in bloodletting flared into a final, frenzied intensity, and the consumption of leeches went utterly vertical. France, in this period, was importing tens of millions of leeches a year to meet demand, and across Europe the medicinal leech was harvested so relentlessly, so far beyond any rate of natural replenishment, that it was driven to the edge of extinction across much of its range, its native wetlands stripped bare of a creature that had been abundant for millennia. A trade that had begun with a peasant standing bare-legged in a pond ended by nearly annihilating an entire species through sheer volume of demand, which is its own quiet lesson in what happens when a whole civilization becomes convinced that the answer to illness is to remove blood and then industrializes the conviction. I want to be fair to the medieval physicians here, though, because it is very easy to look at all this and conclude they were simply idiots, bleeding people for no reason with worms, and that's not right. It's the lazy version of the story. The humoral theory was wrong, catastrophically and consequentially wrong, and bloodletting killed an unknowable number of people who would have done better left alone, weakening the already sick at exactly the moment they needed their strength. But the theory was internally coherent. It was the accumulated wisdom of the greatest medical minds of antiquity. It was applied by intelligent and often genuinely caring practitioners doing their sincere best with the framework they had inherited. And, this is the part that complicates the easy mockery, the leech is not entirely without merit. The medicinal leech is used in real medicine today, right now in modern hospitals, for a narrow but genuine purpose. In reconstructive and microsurgery, leeches are applied to restore blood flow to reattach body parts and skin grafts, where their steady draining and their anticoagulant saliva relieve the dangerous congestion of pooled blood that can kill delicate reattached tissue. The medieval world used the right tool for almost entirely the wrong reasons. Vast and mostly harmful, application built on a false theory. But the tool itself turned out to have a real and specific virtue that modern medicine, having thrown out the humours, eventually rediscovered on properly scientific grounds. None of which changes anything for the person standing in the pond, of course, and that's where I want to leave you. Behind every medieval physician gravely applying a leech to a fevered patient's skin, behind every apothecary's jar of live leeches waiting on the shelf, behind the whole vast edifice of humoral medicine and its centuries of confident bloodletting, There was a person at the very bottom of it all whose contribution was simply their own blood. A rural labourer wading into cold water to be bitten, over and over, day after day, growing pale in the service of other people's cures, carrying home a bucket of blood-fattened worms and a body a little emptier than it had been that morning. The physician got the fee and the dignity and the fine robes, the leech got the meal, and the collector got the bites, the anemia, and the coin. The person whose entire livelihood, stated with total literalness, was to be slowly drained so that medicine could go on believing, for a few more centuries, that draining people was the cure. Chapter 6. The Sin-Eaters at the Threshold. Now to the strangest and, I think, the most quietly heartbreaking trade in this whole collection, a job that existed at the exact border between the living and the dead, between the body and the soul, between the meal on the table and the fate of an immortal spirit. The sin-eater, a person, almost always desperately poor and social outcast, who was paid to sit down beside a corpse, eat a meal that had been placed upon or passed over the dead body, and in doing so take into themselves the sins of the deceased, swallowing another person's guilt, quite literally consuming it, so that the dead could go cleaner to God, while the eater walked away carrying one more load of borrowed damnation. Tonight we're at the threshold, and I'll be honest that the deadpan is going to run thin in places here, because this one is more sad than funny, and I'd rather tell it straight than force a joke it doesn't deserve. The practice is best documented in the folk customs of Wales and the border counties of England, the Welsh Marches, Herefordshire, Shropshire, that borderland country, and it survived, remarkably, into surprisingly recent times, with accounts and recollections of it lingering into the 19th century and the fringes of living memory, which is part of why we know as much about it as we do. It sat at the very edge of official religion, in the murky, resilient world of folk belief that persisted underneath and alongside the formal doctrines of the Church, in that layer of practice that the clergy often knew about, frequently disapproved of, and mostly failed to stamp out. And it addressed one of the deepest anxieties the medieval and post-medieval Christian world carried, the terror of dying unshriven, of going into death with sins still on the soul, unconfessed and unabsolved, and facing the long punishment of purgatory or worse with that weight undischarged. To feel the force of the sin-eater, you have to feel that terror, because it was real and it was enormous. The medieval Christian universe was one in which the fate of your soul after death depended entirely on the state you died in, whether your sins had been confessed, absolved and atoned for, or whether they clung to you still as you crossed over. A good death was a prepared death. The priest summoned in time, the last confession made, absolution given, the final sacraments administered, the soul sent off shriven and ready. But death did not always cooperate. People died suddenly, died in accidents, died before the priest could come, died with sins unconfessed and the account unsettled, and for the grieving family the horror of that was not merely emotional, but cosmic. Their beloved dead might be facing punishment right now, in the unimaginable duration of the afterlife, because death had come before absolution could. Into that specific agonizing gap stepped the sin-eater, offering something the terrified family desperately wanted, and the official church could not straightforwardly provide. A way, however unsanctioned, to lift the burden from the dead soul after death had already taken it. The ritual itself, as it comes down to us in the accounts, was stark and strange and had the plainness of the very old. When someone died, a meal was prepared, most often bread and ale, the humblest of foods, sometimes with other simple fare, and this food was placed on the body of the corpse, or on a plate resting on the chest, or passed across the body, so that it made contact with the dead and, in the logic of the rite, absorbed the sins of the deceased into itself. The sin-eater was then summoned to the house, sat down and ate the meal there beside the corpse, consuming the food and with it, according to the belief, consuming the sins it now carried, taking the dead person's spiritual burden into his own body and his own soul. Often there was a spoken formula, a pledge that the eater took the sins upon himself and gave the departed soul peace and rest, and then a small payment, a few pennies, sometimes just the food itself, sometimes a token coin, and the sin-eater rose and left, carrying away what he had swallowed. The dead soul was lightened, the eater was heavier, the family had done what they could, and the coin changed hands for the grimmest piecework imaginable, and the eater paid for that coin in a coin of his own, which is the part that turns the whole thing tragic. To be a sin-eater was to be an outcast, and not incidentally but essentially, because the very logic of the job made the eater into a repository of accumulated sin. A person understood by the community to be carrying in his own soul the massed guilt of every corpse he had eaten beside. He was useful, even necessary at the moment of death, summoned when the terror was fresh and the need was sharp, and he was shunned, avoided, held at arm's length in every other moment, because who would keep close company with a man believed to be spiritually laden with the sins of the dead of a whole parish? It was work that only the truly desperate would take. The destitute, the marginal, the person with no other way to eat, who accepted social and spiritual pariah status in exchange for bread and a few coins, and who was called upon precisely because no one else could be. The sin-eater ate so the community wouldn't have to face its terror alone, and the community repaid that service by treating him as untouchable, needing him at the graveside and wanting him gone from every other threshold. The church, unsurprisingly, hated all of it, and the reasons illuminate exactly why the practice was so heterodox. The whole apparatus of official Christian salvation ran through the church itself, through the priest, the sacraments, confession and absolution, and the appointed channels of grace. The forgiveness of sins was God's to give and the church's to administer. It was not a substance that could be loaded onto a piece of bread and transferred into a hired stranger's stomach for a few pennies. The sin-eater was, from the orthodox point of view, a kind of folk heresy, a magical short-circuit around the proper machinery of salvation, a superstition that presumed to move sin around like a physical object, and to buy after death a peace that the church taught could only come through its own sanctioned means. Clergymen who encountered the custom generally condemned it, and it survived in spite of them, in the borderlands and the poorer country places, in the gap between what the church said and what frightened grieving people actually did when death caught their loved ones unready, which is where a great deal of real human religion has always lived, in that gap between the doctrine and the fear. I keep circling back to the pathos of the arrangement, because I can't quite get past it, and I don't think I should. Consider it from the eater's side. Here is a man so poor that he has agreed to become the designated bearer of other people's damnation, to sit beside strangers' corpses eating bread pulled from the chest of the dead, to take into his own eternal soul, in a world where the soul's fate was the most serious matter there was, the accumulated sins of everyone he was ever summoned to. He did it for bread. He did it because the alternative was to starve, and the community that hired him to save its dead would not lift a finger to save him, treating him instead as the very embodiment of the sin he swallowed on their behalf. There is a terrible tenderness in it. The loneliest imaginable form of piecework, a man ransoming other souls at the cost of his own supposed peril, for coins at thresholds again and again, until he died himself, and one has to wonder, with a chill, who ate the sins of the sin-eater when his own time came, or whether he simply carried the whole borrowed weight of a lifetime of parish deaths across into the dark alone. There's one figure who anchors this for me, a man named Richard Munslow, remembered as perhaps the last of the sin-eaters in the Shropshire area, who died in the early 20th century and whose grave, long neglected, was in more recent years restored and marked, so that the last known practitioner of this ancient trade is not entirely forgotten. And what makes his case so poignant is that Munslow, by the accounts, was not one of the destitute outcasts the role usually fell to. He was a farmer of some means, and he seems to have taken up the old custom out of grief and compassion after losing several of his own children to illness, performing it not from desperation but from a kind of sorrowful kindness, a wish to give comfort. Which means the very last chapter of the Sin-Eater's long history reframes the whole thing. A rite that began as the grimmest survival work a destitute outcast could take on ended, in its final practitioner, as an act of mercy performed by a grieving man who understood better than anyone what it was to send someone you loved into the dark and to want, with everything in you, to know they'd gone there clean. So the Sin-Eater takes his place among our strange medieval trades, but he takes it a little apart from the others, standing at the threshold in the dim light of the death room, eating his bread and ale beside the still form, taking the weight so someone else's soul could rise lighter. The man who made his living, such as it was, by swallowing other people's guilt, and who was despised for carrying exactly the burden that everyone else was too frightened to carry themselves. Not a funny job, but a deeply, achingly human one, and I didn't want to rush past it in the dark. Chapter 7. Relic Forgers and the Holy Bone Trade. Now to a trade that combined big money, deep faith, and truly shameless fraud into one of the most lucrative scams the medieval world ever ran. The manufacture and sale of holy relics, the bones of saints, the splinters of the true cross, the vials of sacred blood and milk and tears produced in bulk, sold at a premium, and faked on a scale so vast that by the medieval reckoning, there were enough fragments of the one cross Christ was crucified on to build a small navy, and enough heads of John the Baptist scattered across Europe to field a decent-sized committee. Tonight we're in the holy bone trade, and this one is a genuine delight, because the comedy writes itself. It is medieval eBay, with far worse authentication and infinitely higher stakes. Start with why a relic was worth anything at all, because the value was completely real even when the object was completely fake. In medieval Christianity, a relic was a physical remnant of a saint or of Christ himself. A bone, a tooth, a lock of hair, a scrap of clothing, an object the holy person had touched, and it was understood to be a genuine conduit of divine power, a point where heaven touched earth, radiating spiritual potency that could heal the sick, work miracles, answer prayers, and confer blessing on whoever possessed or venerated it. This was not vague sentiment, it was concrete theology and concrete practice. Relics healed diseases, protected against harm, guaranteed the presence and intercession of the saint, and a church or monastery that possessed a good relic possessed something enormously valuable. A magnet for pilgrims, and pilgrims meant traffic, and traffic meant money, endless money, flowing in from the faithful who travelled sometimes across the whole of Christendom to pray before a famous relic, and who left offerings, paid for lodging, bought candles and badges and food, and generally poured wealth into whatever town was lucky enough to hold the sacred object. This is the engine that drove the entire market, and it's crucial to grasp its scale. A major relic was an economic asset of the first rank, the medieval equivalent of a town landing a huge tourist attraction that runs at capacity year-round forever. The great pilgrimage centres were built on relics: Santiago de Compostela, on the supposed body of the Apostle Saint; James, Canterbury on the martyred Thomas Becket, whose shrine drew the pilgrims Chaucer immortalised, and whose offerings made the cathedral rich; Cologne on the claimed bones of the three Magi, the very wise men of the Nativity, which the city acquired in the 12th century and around which it built one of the most magnificent shrines in Europe. A cathedral with a first-rate relic was a cathedral with a permanent income. A town with a famous shrine was a town with a permanent economy. And that is precisely why the temptation to manufacture relics was so overwhelming, and the supply so miraculously abundant, because the demand was effectively infinite, and the reward for meeting it was a river of gold that never ran dry. And so the fakes flowed, in staggering, almost comical profusion. The most famous example, the one that even medieval people themselves joked about, was the true cross, the cross of the crucifixion, supposedly discovered by Saint Helena, mother of the Emperor Constantine, in the 4th century, and thereafter distributed as fragments to churches across Christendom. The trouble was that the fragments kept multiplying, church after church claiming its own splinter of the genuine article, until the total volume of purported true cross scattered across Europe vastly exceeded anything a single cross could ever have yielded. The reformer John Calvin, writing later in the 16th century with obvious relish, made exactly this point, that if you gathered up all the claimed fragments of the true cross, you'd have enough wood to load a ship, far more than any one man could carry, let alone be crucified upon. Saints fared no better under this arithmetic. Multiple churches claimed to hold the one true head of John the Baptist. Various places claimed the same saint's entire body, while others simultaneously claimed the same saint's body elsewhere. There were enough fingers and arms and skulls of popular saints in circulation to reassemble the holy dead several times over. The relic market had no quality control and effectively no upper limit on supply, and the result was a landscape littered with duplicates, triplicates, and outright inventions, all venerated with total sincerity by the faithful who came to pray before them. Some of the fakes were gloriously, almost admirably absurd, reaching for relics that no theology could actually support. There were vials claimed to hold the milk of the Virgin Mary, displayed in numerous churches, in such quantity that the same Calvin scoffed that no single woman could have produced so much were she a cow. There were feathers claimed to have fallen from the wings of the Archangel Gabriel, or the angel Gabriel's own presence, straw from the manger of the Nativity, vials of the darkness that fell over Egypt, and, my personal favourite for sheer nerve, relics purporting to be the holy prepus, the foreskin of Christ, left behind at his circumcision, of which multiple churches across Europe claim to possess the one genuine article, a claim that raised theological problems so acute and so awkward that the church itself grew deeply uncomfortable discussing it. When your relic inventory includes several competing foreskins of the same divine person, you have wandered some distance from careful authentication and deep into a market that will manufacture and sell literally anything the faithful can be persuaded to venerate. The mechanics of the fraud were as varied as human ingenuity. At the crudest end, you simply took bones, animal bones, the bones of ordinary anonymous dead, whatever was to hand, and declared them to be the bones of a saint, furnishing them with a story and a name and a suitably ancient-looking reliquary. Relics were manufactured wholesale, dug up, invented, relabelled. A convenient skeleton could become a martyr with the right paperwork and the right pitch. There was theft, too, on an industrial scale, and with a wonderfully medieval theological justification. The practice known as furta sacra, holy theft, in which monks and churchmen stole relics from other churches and justified it on the grounds that the saint must have wanted to move, that if the theft succeeded it proved the saint's own willingness to be relocated, since surely a powerful saint could have prevented the removal of his own bones had he objected. This was a genuine and widespread rationale, allowing the pious larceny of sacred objects to be reframed as the saint's own migration, and it produced a lively black market in stolen holiness alongside the manufactured kind. And then there were the travelling relic sellers, the pardoners and the peddlers, moving from town to town with their bags of dubious wonders, selling fragments and indulgences to the credulous, the type Chaucer skewered so memorably in The Pardoner of the Canterbury Tales, a man who cheerfully carried a pillowcase he passed off as the Virgin's veil, and a jar of pig bones he sold as the relics of saints, fleecing the poor while preaching against greed, a portrait drawn from a con so common that Chaucer's audience recognised it instantly. The church's position on all this was predictably tangled, and the tangle is the interesting part. Officially, the church venerated relics and defended their theology absolutely. The power of relics was real doctrine, the veneration of them was orthodox and encouraged, and the great shrines were pillars of the institution. But the church was also perfectly aware that the market was riddled with fraud, that fake relics were everywhere, that unscrupulous sellers were defrauding the faithful, and periodically it tried to impose some order. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 attempted to regulate the trade, ruling that newly discovered relics could not be venerated without church approval and taking aim at the sellers who hawked relics for profit. But regulation ran hard against the institution's own deep interest, because the church's own greatest churches and monasteries were the biggest beneficiaries of the relic economy, and the same institution that occasionally cracked down on fraudulent peddlers was itself running the most lucrative relic shrines in existence. It was, structurally, an authority trying to police a market. It was simultaneously the largest player in, never a recipe for rigorous enforcement, and so the fakes flowed on, tolerated in practice even as they were condemned in principle, because too much money and too much genuine faith depended on the whole apparatus continuing to turn. And here is where I want to be careful, because it would be easy to end this chapter as pure mockery. Look at the gullible medievals buying pig bones and angel feathers, and that's too cheap, and it's not quite true. The people who venerated these relics were not stupid. They were operating inside a coherent and deeply felt worldview in which the boundary between heaven and earth was genuinely permeable, in which holy objects genuinely carried power, and in which the sincere faith of the pilgrim was, in a sense, doing real work regardless of the object's authenticity. The healing and comfort people reported at shrines were real experiences, whatever the provenance of the bone. The fraud was real, and the money was real, and the cynicism of the sellers was often bottomless, but so was the faith of the buyers. And the strange thing about the relic trade is that both things were fully true at once. It was one of the most shameless commercial scams in European history, and it was also one of the most sincere expressions of popular devotion European history ever produced. And the same object could be a conman's fake and a pilgrim's genuine encounter with the divine at the very same moment, depending entirely on which end of the transaction you stood. So picture the whole extraordinary market. The cathedrals growing rich on their saints, the pilgrims flowing across a continent to kiss a reliquary, the monks stealing bones and calling it the saint's own wish, the pardoners on the road with their bags of pig bones and pillowcase veils, the churches quietly hosting their third head of John the Baptist, and their competing vials of the Virgin's milk, and the whole thing running on an unbeatable combination of infinite demand, infinite supply, no authentication, and the deepest faith a civilization ever held. It is the purest example in this entire series of a bizarre way to make money, because the money was enormous and the fraud was rampant and the belief was utterly genuine all at once. A trade where a splinter of ordinary wood, sold with enough conviction, became worth more than gold, because a whole world had agreed that heaven could be held in the hand, and where there is that much longing, there will always be someone willing to sell it a piece of the cross. Chapter 8. Fools, Dwarfs, and the Business of Being Watched. Now to a profession built entirely on being looked at. The court entertainers, the fools and jesters, the people kept at court specifically to be watched, to amuse, to perform, and, in the case of the very best of them, to say the one thing nobody else in the entire kingdom was permitted to say, the truth to the king's face, and get paid for it. Tonight we're in the business of foolery, and this one is warmer than most because behind the cap and bells sits one of the genuinely clever survival strategies of the medieval court. The discovery that if you were funny enough, you could insult the most powerful man in the world and he would laugh and hand you money. Start with a distinction the medieval world took seriously and that we've mostly flattened, because it matters a great deal to how these people lived. There were, broadly, two kinds of fool, and they were not the same job at all. The first was the licensed or artificial fool, a performer, a skilled entertainer who chose foolery as a craft and was, underneath the motley, a sharp and capable professional playing a role. This was the jester in the proper sense, a witty, quick, verbally dexterous entertainer who sang, joked, juggled words and objects, mocked and mimicked and performed, and who was fully in command of his own act, playing the fool as an actor plays a part. The second kind was the natural fool, a person with what we would now understand as some form of intellectual disability or developmental difference, kept at court not for a crafted comic act, but because their genuine simplicity or strangeness was found amusing or endearing, and who existed at court in a far more vulnerable position, an object of entertainment rather than a master of it. The line between the two could blur, and the same court might keep both, and I want to hold on to the difference throughout, because the natural fool raises real ethical weight that the deadpan shouldn't skate over. Some of these people were beloved dependents genuinely cared for, and some were exploited spectacles, and the medieval court contained both fates. The licensed fool, though, the true jester, is where the fascinating part lies, because his position rested on a genuine paradox that made him uniquely powerful for someone of no rank at all. His entire social function was to be beneath consideration, a figure of no status, a licensed idiot whose words carried no weight and demanded no respect. And precisely because his words officially meant nothing, he could say things that from anyone else would be treason. The jester operated under a kind of protective immunity, the understanding that the fool's speech was not to be taken as the speech of a responsible man, that his mockery was play, his insults were jokes, his criticism was mere foolery not to be answered as a serious challenge. And a clever fool used that immunity like a scalpel. He could tell the king he was wrong. He could mock the king's decisions, ridicule his favourites, puncture his vanity, deliver hard truths and unwelcome news, and voice the criticism that every courtier was thinking and none of them dared say aloud, all wrapped in a joke, all delivered from the safe position of the man who officially mattered so little that his words couldn't possibly be an offence. In a court where honest speech to the monarch was rare and dangerous, where courtiers survived by flattery and telling the king what he wanted to hear, the fool was often the only channel through which uncomfortable truth could reach the throne, and a wise king valued him precisely for that. There's a story that captures this perfectly, from the court of Philip VI of France, in the run-up to the naval disaster at Slees in 1340, one of the opening catastrophes of the 100 Years' War, where the French fleet was annihilated by the English. The tale goes that Philip's jester was tasked with breaking the terrible news of the defeat to the king, and did so by declaring that the English sailors were cowards, and when the puzzled king asked why, the fool replied that the English, unlike the brave French, had not dared to jump into the sea, whereas the French sailors had leapt overboard in their thousands. It's a grim joke about the French drowning en masse in their defeat, and its whole point is the delivery mechanism. The fool could tell the king his fleet had been destroyed, could even mock the manner of the disaster, because he told it as a joke, from within his protective foolishness, in a way no admiral or minister could have survived saying plainly. The news arrived. The king absorbed it. Nobody was executed for the impertinence, because it came from the fool, and the fool was allowed. The famous names bear out how genuinely valued and genuinely secure the best of these performers could be. Henry VIII kept a celebrated fool named Will Summer or Summers, who served the king for years, appears in royal portraits alongside the royal family, and seems to have held a real and affectionate place in Henry's volatile court. No small feat, surviving in the good graces of a king who disposed of wives and chancellors with equal ease, and Summer managed it through wit, through his ability to lighten the king's black moods, through being the one person who could reliably make Henry laugh. He was rewarded, clothed, maintained, kept close, and outlasted a great many grander figures at that lethal court. Elizabeth I kept fools. The tradition ran through the courts of Europe, and the archetype was potent enough that Shakespeare built some of his most piercing characters around it. The fool in King Lear, who alone dares tell Lear the truth about his own folly, speaking wisdom disguised as nonsense, is a direct portrait of exactly this function. The licensed truth-teller whose foolishness is the license, and Shakespeare understood and expected his audience to understand that the wisest voice in the room was often the one wearing the cap and bells. There's a piece of household economics worth pausing on, because it reveals how these people were actually classified and kept. The court fool was, in institutional terms, a member of the household, maintained like other servants, fed, housed, clothed at the crown's expense, given the motley coat and sometimes the elaborate costume that marked the office, and in some cases quite handsomely provided for, drawing what amounted to a good living for the work of amusing the great. The role could come with real perks and real security. A successful fool had a permanent place, a guaranteed maintenance, the protection of a powerful patron, and access, through his performances, to the most powerful people in the realm, which he could sometimes parlay into genuine informal influence, since the man who could make the king laugh was a man worth cultivating. Some fools grew wealthy, some became genuine favourites, some, through their access and their wit, wielded a soft power that their nominal status as licensed idiots entirely concealed. It was, for a person of humble birth and quick mind, one of the very few routes to the top of the social world that did not require noble blood. You could not become a duke by being clever, but you could become the king's cherished fool, and from there you could eat at the centre of everything. The natural fool complicates this picture, and honesty requires sitting with the discomfort rather than joking past it. Some individuals were kept at court, and in noble and even royal households, essentially as living curiosities, people whose disabilities or unusual appearance made them objects of entertainment. And this shades into territory that is genuinely troubling to modern eyes, the keeping of human beings as amusements, sometimes cruelly, their vulnerability the very source of the household's fun. But the picture is not uniformly grim, and that's the part I don't want to lose, because the sources also show real attachment. Some natural fools were clearly beloved, treated with genuine affection and care, protected and provided for in old age, mourned when they died, occupying a place in the household that was closer to a cherished dependent than a mocked spectacle. The medieval household could be a place of casual cruelty toward the vulnerable and a place of surprising tenderness toward them, sometimes within the same walls, and the fool who could not craft an act but was simply kept and looked after existed somewhere along that whole range, from exploited object to loved and protected member of the family, and both extremes and everything between were real. I keep returning to the licensed fool, though, because his was the truly ingenious position, and I think it holds a lesson that outlasts the medieval court entirely. He had no rank, no blood, no land, no formal power whatsoever. He stood officially at the very bottom of the social order, a paid idiot in a jester's coat. And yet, by leaning fully into that bottom position, by embracing the total lack of status as his working method, he acquired something almost no one else at court possessed: the freedom to speak. The great lords, with all their rank, were trapped by it, constrained to flatter and defer and watch every word, because their status made their speech consequential and therefore dangerous. The fool, having no status to lose and no words that officially counted, could say anything. and so the man at the very bottom became, in the one specific dimension of honest speech, freer than the men at the very top. That's a genuinely clever trade, one of the cleverest in this whole series. The discovery that if you make yourself small enough, laughable enough, unthreatening enough, you can tell the most dangerous man in the world exactly what he doesn't want to hear, and walk away not only alive but paid, because you dressed the truth in a joke and handed it over wearing bells. So the fool takes his place in our gallery, the professional entertainer who turned no status into freedom, the man in motley who was often the wisest and bravest voice in a room full of trembling flatterers, the person whose entire livelihood was to be watched and laughed at, and who, if he was good enough, could look the King of England in the eye, tell him a truth that would have hanged anyone else, and get a laugh, a coin, and a warm place by the fire for it. Not a bad living for a fool. Chapter 9. The Executioner's Very Good Side Hustles. Now, to a man everyone in town knew, everyone in town feared, and almost no one in town would sit next to, the executioner, the professional headsman whose day job was the deliberate killing of other human beings, and whose real financial genius lay not in the killing at all, but in the astonishing range of profitable side businesses. He ran on the back of it, quietly selling pieces of the very people he executed to customers who believed those pieces could cure them. Tonight, we're with the headsman, and this one has a proper dark twist at its heart. The most shunned, most polluted, most socially untouchable man in the medieval town was also, on the side, one of its busiest and best-stocked pharmacists. Start with the executioner's strange social position, because it's the key to everything that follows. He held an official, necessary, salaried office. Every town that dispensed justice needed someone to carry out its sentences, to hang, behead, break, burn, and brand the condemned, and to administer the judicial torture that medieval and early modern legal procedure relied upon to extract confessions. This was public work, sanctioned by the authorities, essential to the whole apparatus of law and order. And yet the man who did it was treated as profoundly unclean, socially polluted by his contact with death and with the bodies of criminals, an outcast in his own community. The taint was deep and formal. Executioners and their families were shunned, excluded from respectable society, often forbidden from entering certain establishments, made to live apart, buried apart, their touch considered contaminating, their trade hereditary in part because no one outside the executioner families would marry into them, so that the office passed down bloodlines and dynasties of headsmen, intermarried with other headsmen across generations because respectable families would have nothing to do with them. He was needed and he was despised, sanctioned by the state and shunned by his neighbours, a walking contradiction who did society's necessary killing and was made to carry the pollution of it entirely on his own body. That pollution had a strange consequence, though, which is that it also invested him with a kind of dangerous power in the popular imagination, and dangerous power in the medieval mind was frequently medicinal, because here is the belief system that turned the executioner into a pharmacist. Medieval and early modern folk medicine held, widely and seriously, that the human body, and particularly the bodies of the executed, the young and healthy criminals who died violently in their prime, was a potent source of healing substances. This is the phenomenon that historians call corpse medicine, and it was not a fringe superstition, but a broad and long-lived belief that ran from folk practice right up into the formal pharmacopoeia, endorsed by physicians and sold by apothecaries. The bodies of the dead were medicine, and the executioner, who had the freshest and most abundant supply of exactly the right kind of bodies, was perfectly positioned to be the supplier, and supply he did, across a genuinely startling product range. Consider human fat, which was among the most prized of these substances, rendered from the bodies of the executed and sold as a salve, believed to ease pain, treat wounds, soothe aching joints, and remedy a whole list of ailments when rubbed into the skin. It went by names like poor sinner's fat, and the executioner who prepared the bodies could render and sell it, and did, to customers who rubbed the fat of a beheaded criminal into their sore limbs in complete confidence that it would help. Then there was blood, the fresh blood of the executed, believed especially to cure epilepsy, the falling sickness, so that at public executions people afflicted with epilepsy or their families would press forward to catch the blood of the beheaded in cups as it flowed, or to drink it while still warm, in the conviction that the vital force of a person killed suddenly in their prime could pass into the sick and heal them. There are accounts of crowds gathering at the scaffold not merely as spectators but as patients, waiting for the blood, and the executioner, master of the scaffold and the body, was the natural gatekeeper and vendor of it. The catalogue runs on, and each item is grimmer and more matter-of-fact than the last. Human bone, ground into powder, was used in remedies. Human skull was especially valued. Powdered skull, sometimes with the moss that grew on skulls left exposed, called usnea, was a prized ingredient believed to treat ailments of the head, and the skulls of the executed, of those who died violently and were never buried in consecrated ground, were thought particularly potent, because the vital spirits were held to remain trapped in a body that had died suddenly rather than fading naturally. There was a substance called mummy, or mumia, originally derived from ancient Egyptian embalmed corpses ground into powder and taken as a medicine for an enormous range of conditions. And as genuine Egyptian mummies grew scarce and expensive, the trade turned to substitutes. The bodies of the recently dead, including the executed, processed to make a counterfeit mumia sold to apothecaries. The executioner sat at the source of much of this raw material, the man with legal access to fresh corpses, the knowledge of how to process them, and a clientele that came to him precisely because his terrible trade gave him the one thing the corpse medicine market needed: a steady, reliable supply of the freshly and violently dead. Beyond the body parts, he had still other income streams, because the whole grim apparatus of execution generated saleable byproducts. The rope used in a hanging was believed to carry luck and healing power, and pieces of the hangman's rope were sold as charms and remedies, thought to cure headaches and bring good fortune, so that the executioner could cut up and sell the very rope he had hanged a man with, retailing the instrument of death as a lucky talisman. The mandrake root, that famous plant of medieval magic, was believed in legend to grow beneath the gallows, springing from the bodily fluids of the hanged, and the executioner, master of the gallows ground, was associated with its harvest and trade. He could sell access to the body, sell the right to touch the corpse for luck, sell the various pieces and products of his trade, and on top of all of it he drew fees for the executions and torture sessions themselves, often charging per task, per stroke, per procedure, with an established schedule of payments for each grim service rendered. Add it together, the salary, the execution fees, the torture fees, the fat, the blood, the bone, the skull, the rope, the whole apparatus of corpse medicine flowing through his hands, and the executioner, for all his social pollution, was frequently a man of substantial and reliable income, sometimes genuinely wealthy, running one of the more diversified small businesses in the entire town. There's a figure who lets us see all of this from the inside, which is rare and precious for a trade whose practitioners mostly left no words. Franz Schmidt was the public executioner of Nuremberg in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and he kept a diary, a detailed personal journal recording the executions and punishments he carried out over a career spanning some 45 years and several hundred executions, a document that survives and gives us an extraordinary window into the mind and life of a professional headsman. Schmidt emerges from his own pages as something quite unlike the monster the officer's reputation might suggest. A sober, pious, methodical, deeply professional man, a devout Lutheran who took his work with total seriousness, who saw himself as an instrument of justice rather than a killer, who did not drink and disapproved of those who did, and who spent much of his life quietly campaigning to have the social stigma lifted from his office and his family, a campaign in which he ultimately remarkably succeeded, winning from the authorities a formal restoration of honourable status for himself and his descendants near the end of his long life. Schmidt also practised healing. Executioner's intimate knowledge of the body, of its bones and joints and workings, gained through the grim expertise of torture and dismemberment, made many of them sought after informal physicians and bone setters, and Schmidt treated thousands of patients over his career, a healer as well as a killer, mending bodies with the same hands that broke them. That last detail is the one I want to leave you turning over, because it dissolves the easy picture entirely. We imagine the medieval executioner as a hooded brute, a figure of pure menace, and the reality was so much stranger and so much more human. A man polluted and shunned by his neighbours, yet essential to their justice, a killer by profession who was often also a healer by sideline, a person whose intimate professional knowledge of the human body served both the taking of life on the scaffold and the mending of it in the treatment room, and whose income flowed from a business model that turned the byproducts of death directly into medicine for the living. He was the most feared and most avoided man in town, the one whose touch was thought to contaminate, who lived apart and married apart and was buried apart. And he was also, when your joints ached or your child had the falling sickness, or your wound would not heal, quite possibly the man you went to see cup in hand for a cure. The town that would not let him into its taverns came, in its sickness and its desperation, to buy the fat and the blood and the powdered bone he rendered from the bodies it had condemned. And the same hands that everyone shrank from in the street were the hands people reached for when the physicians had failed, and the body was the only pharmacy left. So the executioner takes his place among our strange medieval trades, not as the simple ogre of the popular imagination, but as one of the most economically ingenious and socially paradoxical figures in the whole medieval town. The outcast with the diversified income, the killer who healed, the polluted man whose pollution was itself a product he sold, drawing his living from every stage of death, and from the deep human hope that even in the bodies of the condemned there might be something that could make the living well again. Chapter 10. Ale conners, rat catchers, and the odd job underworld. And so we come to the last chapter, and for our closing tour I want to take you not deeper into a single strange trade but wider, out through the ordinary streets of the medieval town to meet the small, odd, half-forgotten occupations that filled it, the little professions that kept daily life running, and that sound to modern ears like someone made them up, the man who tested beer by sitting in it, the licensed killers of rats, the arrow makers and the rat catchers, and the whole cheerful underworld of medieval odd jobs. This is the gentle, wandering, cosy end of our journey, and it's the right note to finish on, because these are the trades that remind you the medieval world was not only kings and executioners and sin-eaters, but a whole ordinary economy full of people making a living in ways that were strange and specific and entirely real. Let's begin with my favourite, the one whose signature method is too good to be true and delightfully as true, or at least true enough to have become the trade's enduring legend, the ale conner. The ale conner was an official appointed by the town to inspect and test the quality of the ale and beer sold within it, a genuine office of medieval and early modern local government, because ale was not a luxury but a staple, one of the basic foodstuffs of medieval life, drunk by everyone including children because the water was often unsafe and small beer was the safer daily drink. Ale mattered enormously to daily survival and to the town's revenue, and so its quality and its measure were regulated, and the ale conner, sometimes called the ale taster, was the man who did the regulating, going from alehouse to alehouse to test that the ale was good, wholesome, properly made, and honestly measured, and to check it against the assize of ale, the legal standard that governed its price and strength. This was a real, sworn civic office, taken seriously, with ale conners appointed in towns across England and their appointments recorded in the manorial and borough records. And then there is the method, the glorious legendary method, which is the part everyone remembers. The story goes that the ale conner tested the strength and quality of ale by pouring some onto a wooden bench, and then sitting down in the puddle, clad in leather breeches, and remaining seated there for a set period, perhaps half an hour, drinking and conversing while the ale beneath him did its work, and that when he finally rose he judged the ale by whether his leather breeches stuck to the bench. The reasoning, in the folk explanation, was that ale with too much residual sugar, improperly or incompletely fermented or adulterated, would be sticky and would glue the breeches to the wood, betraying itself as inferior, while good, properly fermented ale would leave no such stickiness and the taster would rise cleanly. I have to be honest with you, as always, historians are genuinely uncertain whether this sitting in the ale test was ever really standard practice, or whether it's a wonderful later legend that grew up around the office, because the reliable records describe the ale conner's serious duties, tasting, measuring, checking quality and price, far more than they describe anyone's sticky trousers. But the legend is old and beloved and captures something true about the flavour of the office, a job whose whole purpose was to sit in alehouses drinking beer at public expense and pronounce judgment on it, which even without the leather breeches is a genuinely enviable civic appointment. From the alehouse to the rafters and to the rat catcher, a trade far grimmer in its purpose and just as real in its necessity. The medieval town was overrun with rats and mice, vermin that infested homes, granaries, ships, warehouses, and every place food was stored, destroying provisions, spreading filth, and, though no one understood the mechanism until centuries later, carrying the fleas that carried the plague that periodically annihilated a third or more of the population. Controlling the vermin was serious, constant, essential work, and the rat catcher was the professional who did it, a specialist in the trapping, poisoning and killing of rats and mice, hired by households, businesses and towns to clear infestations and keep them clear. It was skilled work in its way. The good rat catcher knew the habits of his quarry, knew where they nested and how they moved, knew the poisons and the traps, and sometimes kept trained animals, dogs and ferrets, to help in the hunt. And it was dangerous work too, bringing the catcher into constant contact with vermin, their bites, and the diseases they carried, so that the man who cleared the plague-bearing rats was himself perpetually exposed to whatever the rats were carrying. The rat catcher often cut a colourful figure, some of them showmen who advertised their prowess theatrically, wearing sashes hung with dead rats as proof of their skill, carrying poles strung with their catch, part exterminator and part street performer, and the trade persisted for centuries as one of the essential, unglamorous, oddly vivid occupations of urban life. Let's keep wandering, because the medieval economy specialised to a degree that produced a wonderful profusion of narrow trades, each a whole livelihood built on one specific thing. Consider the fletcher, whose entire craft was the making of arrows, fitting the feathers, the fletchings that give the name, to the shafts, and producing the arrows that medieval warfare consumed in genuinely astronomical quantities, because a battle involving massed archers, the English longbowmen who won Crécy and Agincourt, expended arrows by the hundreds of thousands, and every one of those arrows had to be made by hand, shaft and head and fletching by specialists. The fletcher was distinct from the bowyer, who made the bows themselves, and from the arrowsmith, who forged the iron arrowheads. 3 separate trades feeding the single act of shooting an arrow, each a guild, each a livelihood, so specialised that the surnames survive among us still. Every fletcher and every bowyer and every archer carries a medieval job description in their name, as do the smiths and the coopers and the chandlers and the wrights. The whole population of ordinary medieval occupations fossilised in the family names we pass around today without a thought, and the specialisation ran on into corners you would never think to invent. There was the chandler, who made candles, no small thing in a world lit by nothing else after dark, where the tallow candle and the finer beeswax candle were the only defence against the long medieval night, and candle making was a substantial trade with its own guild. There was the cooper, who made barrels, again no small thing, because in a world without cans or bottles or cardboard, the barrel was the universal container, holding ale and wine and water and salted fish and flour and nails and gunpowder, and nearly everything else that had to be stored or shipped, so that the cooper's watertight casks were among the most essential manufactured objects in the whole economy. There was the limner who painted the illuminations in manuscripts, the parchmenter who prepared the animal skins that manuscripts were written on, the horner who worked in horn to make combs and cups, and the thin translucent panes that served as cheap windows, the pardoner selling his indulgences, the scrivener writing documents for the illiterate, the water carrier hauling fresh water through streets that had none on tap, the rag-and-bone man collecting the discarded for resale, the knocker-up who in later centuries woke sleeping workers by tapping on their windows because alarm clocks did not exist. A whole teeming ecosystem of tiny, specific, real occupations, each one a way that some medieval person fed themselves by doing one narrow necessary thing that the life of the town required. That is the thing I most want to leave you with, as our long journey through these strange trades comes to its close and the fire burns down. It is easy, looking back across the centuries, to see the medieval world as a place of a few grand roles, the king, the knight, the priest, the peasant, and to imagine that most people simply worked the land in an undifferentiated mass. But the truth is so much richer and stranger, and more human than that. The medieval world was full of people making their livings in ways precisely as specific, as ingenious, and as odd as anything in our own economy of app developers and social media managers and professional organisers. And when we laugh at the ale conner in his leather breeches, or the gong farmer with his lantern, or the sin eater at the threshold, we are really only laughing at how different the specific needs of that world were from ours, because the underlying thing, a person looking at the world around them, finding a need, and figuring out how to feed themselves by meeting it, is exactly, precisely, what we still do. Every one of us, every day. The needs change. The trades change. The mandrake root and the porcinous fat and the hired grief and the tested ale pass out of the world and are replaced by needs we can barely explain to our own grandparents. But the person doing the work, clever, adaptable, resourceful, finding the gap and filling it and going home with a coin at the end of the day, That person is the same across all the centuries, and there is something genuinely comforting in that, in the deep continuity between the gong farmer's ingenuity and our own, across the 700 years that separate us. And so we reach the end of our wander through the most bizarre ways medieval people made money. The whipping boys and the grooms of the stool, the gong farmers and the professional mourners, the leech collectors and the sin-eaters, the relic forgers and the fools and the executioners and the ale-conners, the whole strange, vivid, resourceful, entirely human parade of people who looked at the world they were born into and found, against all odds and often against considerable smell and danger and social ruin, a way to make a living. Thank you for spending this long, quiet while with me, wherever in the world you're listening from tonight. I hope the strangeness was good company, and I hope you drift off soon into an easy sleep, untroubled by cesspits or leeches or the sins of the dead. Rest well. The fire's low, the door's shut, the medieval night is quiet outside, and there's nothing left to do now but sleep. I'll see you next time, here at the Somnorian. Good night.